Dr. Edward Anderson understands the causal relationship between time away from the classroom for a student and educational outcomes, and he's committed to keeping students on track to and through graduation. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Edward Anderson. I serve as the Executive Director for On Track Greenville here at United Way of Greenville County. And part of our role is to keep students on track to graduate from school on time, but to also increase pathways for them to achieve post-secondary success. And part of our mission with On Track Greenville, we seek to eliminate barriers, which come in many forms for our students to achieve success, but we also work to mobilize resources, and those resources look differently in order for our students to graduate on time and have post-secondary success. When we talk about barriers for a second, we talk about those external barriers like food, housing, transportation, um, and then when we talk about internal barriers, we're talking about things like sometimes adverse childhood experiences, trauma, but oftentimes we're talking about bias. Within our work, we started working around students and providing interventions, but what we later found out was we can't serve the whole child by just focusing on students, but we have to focus on the adults that serve and work with our students as well. And so our reach has expanded into our families, communities, and staff at school as well in terms of providing resources and eliminating barriers. So when we talk about bias in an educational setting, we're talking about when one group or an individual student is treated differently. Oftentimes, those differences come from stereotypes that a staff member or a community member may have about a certain child or a family, certain narratives that have been created in their heads, or and oftentimes based on their experiences with a certain group or a certain child or a certain family or a certain situation even. I can't tell you how many times as a former principal I encountered teachers, other administrators that would say, "Oh my goodness, here comes John. I had his older brother Bill," and many of you can probably attest to this. And Bill was a handful, so I know John will be. And their whole experience with John is based on what happened with Bill. Unfair to that student, and that student's whole trajectory has shifted based on their sibling and based on that adult's narrative. So stereotypes sometimes work against, right, our students, but sometimes stereotypes or bias work for. Um, a lot of times people will bring up integration and segregation in Greenville in particular, and I know uh, Greenville County Schools within the last couple of years had its 50th anniversary of integration of schools. And within that, there were lots of narratives that came out. One of the narratives out of the Black community was in regards to the traditional Black schools in this county. And within that, those schools were often housed by or staffed by all Black staff, typically people who worked within those communities, who knew the students that they were serving, and it was very community oriented. And so oftentimes we saw those Black students have better outcomes because uh, those people in those communities knew, understood, and a narrative about those students was a lot different than once students integrated. So once integration happened, you had a lot of staff in schools not come back as teachers or other staff members, and then you had a new population of adults interacting with students for the first time, and what they carried was their narrative or stereotype about students, which influenced the whole system, right? Um, Mr. Blassingame mentioned earlier school to prison pipeline, and I had no intention of talking about school to prison pipeline until he mentioned it, and I'm compelled to say something about it. But when I think about school to prison pipeline in schools, people say, like, what does that really mean? Like, what? And I think as simply narrated as possible, the way that I put it is, you have a student who enters kindergarten, and let's just say a Black male student who enters kindergarten, and a Black male student um, exhibits certain behaviors, uses certain slang or phrasing, dresses in a certain way, and the teacher and 90% of teachers in America are white, primarily female, and only 2% of teachers in America are black males. So, in terms of representation, in terms of advocacy, in terms of policy influence, particularly is not influenced by the black male demographic. And I use black male because black males have the lowest outcomes out of any student group in schools. And so that student comes into schools and is met with a teacher who may not understand that student's background, their culture, and again carry a certain narrative or stereotype about that student. So instead of meeting it with a sense of understanding, it's met with two things. One is consequence, discipline, that you're not acting accordingly and according to the way things have been set up. And so again, that student is then suspended, and preschool and kindergarten students are receiving sometimes more referrals than elementary and middle school students, by the way. Those students start to get pushed out. Or it's met with, okay, well, the student is not learning and I don't know how to reach them, so there's got to be something wrong. There must be something wrong. So those students will oftentimes get staffed into special education classes and get a label, really, that for students that have a disability, that's appropriate, but for a student who just simply can't connect because of relationship or understanding from an adult is not a disability. And so oftentimes you have a lot of black boys essentially in special education courses early on. A lot of times the by the time they get to third grade, and what we know is there's a correlation between third grade reading levels and prison and incarceration later. Those students are not held to higher expectations. Teachers will then say, well, the student has a disability, so our expectations are then lowered for our students. So they get treated differently in class, oftentimes passed along. And then when they're not cute little elementary kids anymore and they get to middle school and they're pimply faced, 6 foot tall, big boys, then they get pushed out even more. And then the disciplinary consequences aren't go sit in the corner or it's okay, you have a disability and I understand. It's you're disrupting this class and you have to get out. Once they get to high school and they want to go into a career and the career says in order to go to a career center, you can't have more than 3 or 4 referrals. Well, they already have more than 3 or 4 referrals, so that pathway is cut off. They no longer have access to those things anymore. And then they're not graduating, they're dropping out, they're not on track. And so when we talk about school to prison pipeline, it starts a long time ago. It doesn't start with the school just putting school resource officers in place and so forth. It starts with that relationship at an early age. And that's how narratives and stereotypes can have a detrimental impact on our students. I think I have a minute left. I knew this was going to happen. Hilario Benson is the former president of the National Education Association, and he says there are a few things that we can do about bias in schools. And one is name it and claim it. Not spend too much time over analyzing bias, but create a culture. Right? Part of On Track's work is creating climate and culture, creating belonging and inclusion. That outweighs any intervention. Just simply creating a culture where people can share and their grievances, where people can call out, "Hey, colleague, I think what I noticed today is X." That person named it, and the other person claims it. Okay, let me analyze that. Another thing he says is mirrors and windows. We need to look in mirrors more often. We need to check ourselves daily. And the way that I do that is putting a sticky note on my laptop every morning that says, check yourself. Every time I open that laptop, I'm reminded to check myself or put it on your mirror in the bathroom because we have to develop habits of mind around something as deep as bias. And so if the day that sticky note is not on that laptop, I still remember when I open up my laptop because I'm used to it to check myself. We have to be willing to do that, and then looking through a window and ensuring that we have to be able to see bias and acknowledge it. Just as Jessica Sharp mentioned earlier, we have a brain, we all carry it. And I'll just close out with um, in a world that's full of bias, we are losing our students every day in schools, with every moment, with every narrative, with every stereotype. And if we don't address it, then we are doing so much damage to our community. And we are missing out on the opportunity to have so many geniuses across this community. I think there's an example of something called untapped Einsteins, and that we have a community full of untapped Einsteins because of our own bias that gets in the way of allowing them to be successful. So thank you.
Powerful. As former pastor